Some say tradition keeps faith grounded, others say it holds it back. But what happens when ancient Catholic practices quietly disappear? Were they no longer needed, or did we lose something sacred along the way? Today we're diving into 10 Catholic customs that used to be part of everyday life, but have since vanished from most parishes. From rituals that shaped reverence to celebrations that stirred the soul, these aren't just relics of the past. They raise the question, should the Church bring them back? Let's find out. Number 10. Kissing a bishop's ring. Once a deeply symbolic gesture, kissing a bishop's ring was far more than formality. It was a physical act of reverence, tradition, and spiritual recognition. The ring, bestowed during a bishop's consecration, represented his authority, his sacred office, and his union with the Church. By the 13th century, it had become customary to not only kiss the ring, but also kneel while doing so, mirroring the feudal customs of the time. In those days, the bishop was seen as a spiritual lord, a successor to the apostles, and honoring him this way underscored the divine hierarchy of the Church. This act of humility and respect was practiced widely among both clergy and laypeople for centuries. But by the late 20th century, things began to change. After the Second Vatican Council, the Church began moving toward a more egalitarian image, one that emphasized service over status. In 1968, Pope Paul VI simplified papal regalia, and many bishops began to quietly discourage the custom, hoping to foster a more approachable and less hierarchical presence. Still, in some traditional circles, you might see it done today, especially in settings that retain the older rites and customs. For others, it's now just a memory from old black and white photos or the stuff of Catholic law. Number 9. Churching women after childbirth. Once a familiar moment in the life of Catholic mothers, the rite of churching was a blessing given to women after childbirth, marking their return to the spiritual and communal life of the Church. Though sometimes misunderstood as a purification rite rooted in sin, the ceremony was actually one of gratitude. Typically performed around 40 days postpartum, the priest would bless the mother and give thanks for her safe delivery, asking for continued health and spiritual protection. The tradition echoed ancient Jewish customs of purification and was embraced by early Christians as a way to honor the sacredness of motherhood and the trials of childbirth. By the Middle Ages, churching had become widely practiced and was even included in the official Roman ritual by 1962. It provided a sense of spiritual closure to the childbirth process, an acknowledgement of both the physical sacrifice and divine participation in bringing new life into the world. But like many other devotional customs, churching began to fade during the liturgical reforms of the 1960s and 70s. The Church shifted focus to more inclusive sacraments like infant baptism and blessings for families as a whole. Today, the rite is virtually unheard of in most parishes, but a few traditional communities still request it, not out of superstition, but as a way to honor the journey of motherhood and reconnect with a sacred rhythm long forgotten. Number 8. The priestly maniple. It may look like a small scrap of fabric, but the maniple once carried enormous meaning in the Catholic Mass. Draped over the priest's left forearm, this narrow strip of silk wasn't just decorative, it was symbolic. It represented the priest's labor, his sorrow, and his dedication to Christ's suffering. The maniple traces its roots back to 6th century Rome, where it began as something very practical, a cloth to wipe away sweat during long services. Over time, as the Church layered its rituals with deeper theological meaning, the maniple transformed from a handkerchief into a sacred vestment. It came to signify the burdens of ministry, the call to serve with humility, and the quiet endurance of a priest, offering himself in union with Christ. By the time of the Tridentine Mass, it was standard attire. Every priest wore one, crafted to match the chasuble, rich in color, sometimes adorned with subtle embroidery. But by the 1960s, change was on the horizon. The liturgical reforms brought on by the Second Vatican Council aimed to simplify worship and remove what some considered unnecessary symbolism. In 1969, the Roman Missal officially made the maniple optional, and with that, it all but disappeared from modern liturgy. Today, outside of traditional Latin Mass communities, you'd be hard-pressed to find a priest wearing one. While some still see it as a beautiful symbol of sacrifice and service, to others it's a quaint relic of a more ornate, less accessible church. Number 7. Public processions on Rogation Days. There was a time when Catholic faith spilled out of the churches and into the fields. Rogation Days were one of the most vivid examples of that. Processions where parishioners, priests and altar servers walked the land singing litanies and begging God for protection over their crops, their homes and their lives. These processions weren't just ceremonial, they were deeply tied to the rhythms of agrarian life. Held every year on April 25th and the 3 days leading up to Ascension Thursday, Rogation Days were moments when communities came together to acknowledge their dependence on divine providence. Crosses were lifted high, banners unfurled, relics carried reverently. At various points along the way, priests would stop and bless the earth beneath their feet. The tradition dates back to the early centuries of the Church and took firm root in medieval Europe when failing crops could mean starvation. These days were both practical and prayerful, an intersection of faith and survival. But with urbanization and modern technology, those days slowly faded. As fewer Catholics lived in farming communities and the Church streamlined its calendar in the 1969 liturgical reforms, Rogation Days became optional and mostly disappeared. Still, in some rural pockets of the world, they haven't been forgotten. A handful of traditional parishes revive the custom each spring, walking the land not because they have to, but because they want to remember, to reconnect with the land, the seasons, and the God who made both. Number 6. The Feast of the Circumcision. Once observed every January 1st, the Feast of the Circumcision of Christ was a solemn reminder of Jesus' full participation in human life and his obedience to Jewish law. According to Scripture, he was circumcised 8 days after his birth, in keeping with Jewish tradition. This feast didn't just mark a medical procedure, it emphasized Christ's humanity, his rootedness in covenant, and his submission to the very law he came to fulfill. In the early church, this observance grew in significance, eventually claiming a central spot on the liturgical calendar by the Middle Ages. For centuries, it stood as a powerful reflection of Christ's incarnation and his willingness to fully enter the human condition. Not just spiritually, but physically. But in 1969, as part of sweeping post-Vatican II liturgical reforms, the Church revised its calendar. The Feast of the Circumcision was quietly replaced with the Solemnity of Mary, Mother of God. Supporters of the change say it offers a more accessible entry into the new year, honoring Mary's unique role in salvation history. Critics, however, argue that shifting the focus away from Christ's early suffering dilutes an important theological point and pushes a once Christ-centered feast into the shadows. Was it progress or a loss of depth? That debate still lingers in traditional Catholic circles. And number 5, the Index of Forbidden Books. Imagine a time when reading the wrong book could put your soul in jeopardy, or at least that's how the Church saw it. For over 400 years, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or Index of Forbidden Books, served as the official blacklist of the Catholic Church. From 1559 to 1966, this list named works considered heretical, morally corrupt, or dangerous to the faith. It included writings by Protestant reformers like Martin Luther, Enlightenment figures like Voltaire, and even some Catholic theologians who strayed too far from orthodoxy. If you were Catholic, owning or reading any of these titles without special permission was considered a serious offense. The index wasn't just censorship, it was protection, according to church authorities. It was a defensive measure born during the upheavals of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, when heresy was spreading rapidly and literacy was on the rise. Enforced by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the index sought to guard hearts and minds in a time of chaos. But by the mid-20th century, the world and the Church had changed. The index was formally abolished in 1966 under Pope Paul VI, and the Church began embracing a more dialogical approach to ideas and culture. By 1995, the Vatican had traded bans for recommendations, publishing a list of significant films that aligned with Christian values, an entirely different tone from its past methods. To some, the end of the index marked a turning point toward openness. To others, it signaled the loss of clear moral boundaries in a world still very much in need of them. Number 4. The Midnight Fast. Before Vatican II, going to Mass wasn't just about showing up on time. It was about preparation, discipline, and often a growling stomach. The Midnight Fast was a strict Eucharistic rule: no food or drink, not even water, from the stroke of midnight until you received communion. This was canonized in the 1917 Code of Canon Law and was seen as a powerful act of reverence. It reminded Catholics that receiving the Eucharist was no casual thing. It demanded sacrifice and spiritual hunger, quite literally. That meant for anyone attending a late morning or noon Mass, they could be fasting 12 hours or more. The practice shaped Catholic behavior for decades, influencing everything from breakfast routines to when parishes scheduled Mass. In 1953, Pope Pius XII softened the rules, allowing water and medicine. Then, in 1957, he reduced the fast to 3 hours. Finally, Pope Paul VI, as part of the 1960s reforms, reduced it to just 1 hour, a standard that remains today. Many welcomed the shift. It made daily Mass more accessible and prevented people from avoiding the Eucharist out of physical difficulty. But some Catholics feel the spiritual cost was too high. To them, the rollback of the fast diluted the sense of awe and sacrifice that once surrounded Holy Communion. Was the change practical and pastoral? Certainly. But for those who remember the Midnight Fast, it also marked the beginning of a broader loosening, one they believe the Church is still grappling with. Number 3. The Lenten Veil. Once upon a time, stepping into a Catholic church during Lent meant facing the absence of the familiar. Crucifixes, statues, and images of the saints were veiled behind large drapes of purple cloth, casting the sanctuary in an atmosphere of penance and mystery. This practice, known as the Lenten Veil, dates back to the Middle Ages and was especially observed from Passion Sunday until Good Friday. By covering sacred art, the Church invited the faithful to turn inward to meditate on Christ's suffering and enter into the darkness before the resurrection. The unveiling of those images at Easter wasn't just visual, it was visceral. A symbol of light returning, of joy restored. Often the veils were plain. Other times they bore somber imagery, reminders of Christ's passion and humanity's need for redemption. But the veils have largely vanished. The 1970 Roman Missal, shaped by the liturgical reforms of the 1960s, dropped mandatory veiling in favor of a simpler, more accessible Lenten observance. While a few traditional parishes still carry on the practice, most modern churches favor an open, visually consistent worship space year-round. Still, there's something deeply moving about the idea of longing to see again what was hidden, of feeling the weight of absence before the joy of resurrection. For some, the Lenten veil wasn't just ritual, it was a lesson in the beauty of spiritual restraint. Number 2. Asperges before Mass. Before the first hymn was sung, before the readings began, there was once a moment of quiet preparation, a ritual cleansing. The priest would walk the aisle, sprinkling holy water on the altar, the clergy and the congregation, while the choir chanted the ancient words, Asperge me Domine, hyssop et mundabo. Sprinkle me, O Lord, with hyssop, and I shall be clean. This rite, simply called the asperge, was a symbolic washing, a reminder of baptism, repentance, and the soul's need for renewal before encountering the mystery of the Eucharist. It dates back to at least the 9th century and was a staple of Sunday High Mass in the Tridentine tradition. The mood was reverent, purifying, sacred. But by 1969, liturgical reforms replaced this moment with the penitential act, a general confession said within the Mass itself. The change was meant to unify the structure of the liturgy and make it more accessible, especially in non-Latin speaking congregations. While the asperges is still permitted in the 1962 Missal and practiced by some traditional communities, it's rarely seen in the average parish today. For many, it's a forgotten treasure, one of those small yet powerful gestures that brought a tangible sense of spiritual cleansing to the start of every Mass. Number 1. The Feast of the Holy Innocents and the Boy Bishop. On December 28th, the Church commemorates a somber and often overlooked event, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, the children slaughtered by King Herod in his attempt to kill the Christ child. It's a chilling moment in the Christmas narrative, one that underscores the brutality of the world into which Jesus was born. But in medieval Europe, this feast took on a unique and almost paradoxical tradition, the boy bishop. On this day, a choir boy would be dressed as a bishop, complete with mitre and crozier. He would lead processions, bless the congregation, and even deliver a sermon. For one day, the lowest in the hierarchy became the highest. It was a joyful, whimsical inversion, one meant to honor the humility Christ came to exalt and to remind the faithful that God's kingdom turns earthly power upside down. The boy bishop symbolized innocence, humility, and the idea that holiness isn't confined to rank or age. But by the 16th century, the practice fell out of favor. Protestant critiques and the Council of Trent, aiming for uniformity and seriousness in liturgical celebrations, gradually phased it out. A few traditional enclaves revived it in recent centuries, but for most it's a charming historical footnote. Yet in a world hungry for joy, wonder, and the unexpected, maybe the boy bishop still has something to say. Traditions come and go. Some fade because of progress, others vanish because we forget their meaning. But when we look back at these forgotten Catholic practices, we don't just see rituals, we see values, reverence, rhythms of life that once shaped how millions approached the divine. Maybe some of these belong in the past, maybe others deserve a second look. Either way, they raise an important question for all of us. What have we lost in the name of modernization, and is it worth getting back? Thanks for watching.